should go back to the Oman ceasefire negotiations that were happening. Colonel, we do have a ceasefire in Lebanon. Probably temporary. It's only 10 days.
Well, even a temporary ceasefire is encouraging.
We haven't spoken since the ceasefire at all between Iran and the US. Are you optimistic? I just spoke to Robert Pape, and he said, Mario, he thinks an invasion is imminent. Everything's pointing in that direction. I was a bit surprised by it.
Well, I think on Monday, what will happen when the ceasefire ends, if not before, but I think it'll be Monday, you're going to see what I think Trump hopes will be the final solution for Iran. You'll see a massive air and missile attack. And that massive air and missile attack will last in terms of intensity for several days. This, he hopes, will break Iran effectively, break the state, break the economy, break the society. Now, when it comes to this business of invasion, I think it's absurd. Why are we using that word? If you don't have 1 million men under arms already stationed in the region.
Limited to one of the islands. Sorry, he didn't mean a full invasion, just limited to some of the islands. A limited ground operation.
I think that will be tried, unfortunately. Whether or not it succeeds depends entirely on how can they get in there. I mean, if you look at the current so-called blockade, the blockade is about 500 miles away from the Strait of Hormuz. So if you draw a line across the ocean from virtually the border between Iran and Pakistan over to the edge of Oman, that's about 500 miles out. That's where the blockade begins. Now, that is a demonstration of the effectiveness of the strike zone that Iran has created around its country. In other words, if you move ships beyond that 500-mile limit into a range of Iranian missile and unmanned system strikes, then you're likely to lose some of those ships, or they'll certainly be damaged and put out of action. So that is a demonstration, frankly, of the problem that confronts anybody who wants to bring ground troops into the Persian Gulf. How do you get them in there without being detected? How do you assemble them and pick them up and then move them over to these islands without being detected, targeted, and ultimately hit? Once you're on the island, how do you protect anybody that you put there from the various systems available to strike the islands?
Yeah.
And then ultimately, what difference does it make? What difference does it make if you can sit on that island with some infantrymen? What do you expect those poor soldiers or Marines to do? What are they going to do?
Try to control the Strait of Hormuz, at least have the capability to intercept drones and missiles if they target the ships. So offer some form of security.
That's a lot of equipment then. Are they going to bring in batteries of air defense, air and missile defense? You've got to transport that over water. That means you're going to have to lift it through the airspace. Again, I just don't see any point in it, because that's not how you control the Strait of Hormuz. There are two ways that the Strait of Hormuz is controlled. One is by Lloyd's of London and the inability of anybody to get insurance underwriters to support them who are sitting in the Gulf right now. The second way is to have tactical ballistic missiles, unmanned systems that are all over Iran, dispersed throughout the country, to essentially focus their firepower on ships that might try to go through the Strait of Hormuz. That's how you do it. Now, you don't have to have somebody there with a flashlight at night who waves it and says, stop, or we'll shoot. It's not necessary. Everybody knows if you go up there and you don't have permission to go through there from the Iranians, you're going to be targeted and your vessel will be destroyed. So that's how you control the Strait of Hormuz. Putting somebody on the ground on a couple of islands, unless they have extraordinary capabilities of which I've never heard, maybe directed energy weapons that have magical batteries that'll power them or something, you're not going to control anything. You're not going to have any impact. You're just putting targets out there. You're creating a larger target array for the Iranians.
Colonel, I want to take a step back. Why are we even discussing this? I want to get your stance. Why do you think there'll be, the first thing you said, why there'll be a massive air campaign next week? So I'm in a position where both countries have an incentive to end the war. The US, Trump more than Iran. Trump knows the impact it will have on the economy. Robert Pape was telling me it's all about legacy, which I agree. and I'm sure you've had similar discussions. I've been talking to people that are closer to Trump than I, obviously, and trying to understand what his mindset was before the war. And everyone's talking about legacy. A lot of people were caught by surprise. I was just saying that to the professor, being the president to solve the Iran crisis and maybe control the Strait of Hormuz, give leverage over China. But the war did not go well. Economically, it's been a disaster. Politically, it's been horrible. Militarily, it's not as expected as well with the damages that the US has faced. So considering all these, why would he go back into the war, knowing the outcome?
Well, you're assuming rationality guides policymaking in Washington, D.C. I don't see any rationality. If we were rational, we would never have attacked Iran. Why did we attack Iran? We attacked Iran because Israel and its agents in the United States, worth billions of dollars, demanded that Trump attack Iran. Why did Trump acquiesce? Because he was told that this would be short, sharp, and decisive, that after a few days, the regime would collapse and everything would fall like ripe fruit into his lap. Well, that turned out to be wrong. So suddenly he was compelled to continuous bombing, to start a continuous bombing campaign. That failed. And so we opted for a ceasefire. Why did we opt for a ceasefire? Well, we had to bring in more firepower. We had to bring in more ammunition. We had to bring in more missiles. We wanted to bring in more Marines and airborne troopers, ostensibly for the purpose that you were discussing earlier, seizing some islands or maybe some other points on the ground, or to fly around Iran looking for enriched uranium. I don't know. That didn't go very well the last time we tried it. The bottom line is you're assuming someone is being rational. If Donald Trump were rational, Thursday night a week ago, he would have come out and said, I've given a lot of thought to what we've done and I can't go any further. Military power is the wrong instrument to solve this problem. So I am disengaging our forces from active combat against Iran. We are going to seek out intermediaries that can bring us together and hopefully find a resolution. Well, why didn't he do that? Because he is hostage to Israeli demands and to the demands that Israel's agents in the United States are making. And their demand is very straightforward. First, they wanted regime change. Regime change failed. Having failed to achieve regime change, you then set out to do what? Destroy Iran. Well, we discovered we didn't have enough to do that. Now we're bringing more there. So that's why I say this next round of strikes that will begin next week are designed to be the final solution for Iran, to utterly obliterate the country. Remember when he said he was going to bomb people into the Stone Age? That was a sort of silly way of saying it, but nevertheless, that's what he meant. And that's what you're going to see now, an effort to cause the disintegration of the Iranian state. That's very dangerous, extremely dangerous, because neither China nor Russia are going to sit quietly and watch that happen, assuming it has any chance of success. Now, I personally don't think it has much chance of success, but I'm at least going to give it a 50-50 proposition or probability chance of success, simply because I don't know what that means. I've dealt with the Air Force before, I've dealt with the Navy, and they are very good at amassing firepower. And if you're not too concerned about how much damage you do, in other words, collateral damage, and I don't think they are, then I think it's possible to do enormous, almost fatal damage to the Iranian state. But I don't think it'll work at the same time. In other words, you understand my position.
Yeah, I do. I'm going to ask you questions on the four statements. So you asked if we were rational, we would not have attacked Iran. So the way I look at it is that he was misled by pulling the string of legacy by the people he listens to in Mar-a-Lago, number one. And number two, by faulty intelligence, saying that we could, Israeli intelligence, for example, American intelligence saying, a 1 week operation, 4 or 5 day operation could lead to a regime change. Remember, that was all the talk in January. And that's why he made that decision. And now he's probably upset behind the scenes that Netanyahu or whoever else convinced him, saying, hey, you told me they'll be gone in a week. A month in, they're stronger than ever. So he's faced reality now. And this is why his mindset will be very different now. And then to the statement last week of him saying he'll wipe out a civilization, the way I saw it is, if you want to negotiate an end to the conflict and try to get as much concessions from Iran as possible, you'd want them to believe that boots on the ground or a continuation of the war is on the table. That gives you a better negotiating position. Are these two possibilities as well? Are these two possible, these two theories?
I think multiple possibilities exist in Donald Trump's mind, but let's talk about Donald Trump for a moment. Donald Trump lives and dies by his mentor's 3 rules of life. His mentor, the man who seems to have had more influence over shaping the character and mentality of Donald Trump than anybody else, is a man named Roy Cohn. Now, what did Roy Cohn impart to Donald Trump? What are the 3 rules? Rule number 1, attack, attack, attack. In other words, be on the offensive. From the moment you recognize that you're in competition or in a contest of power, in any sort of conflict, you attack, attack, attack. Okay, secondly, what do? You deny, deny, deny. In other words, whatever you're accused of, true or not, whatever they say about you, good or bad, especially if it's bad, obviously, you deny, deny, deny. You never admit anything. And then finally, what do? You twist whatever the outcome turns out to be into some form of victory for you personally. Now, those are the 3 basic rules that govern the way Donald Trump thinks. You've listened to him. He can turn to an absolute unmitigated disaster and convince everybody in the room that this is actually a big success story.
It's like the regime is the new regime, a better regime, a more moderate regime.
Exactly. So this is what you're dealing with. Secondly, you're talking about a personality that is, and I think I mentioned this the last time we were on together, that faces national and international humiliation. Attacking Iran was utterly absurd and stupid. You're talking about a maritime and aerospace power that is operating 6,000 to 7,000 miles away from its logistical support base. You know, this is not like Cuba. Remember, we had a blockade of Cuba. We called it a quarantine. We had 180 ships involved in that. And remember that Miami was only about 100 miles from Cuba. And we managed to bring that off. Now, it lasted, by the way, 59 days from the time the first nuclear-armed Russian, or at that point Soviet missile arrived, until the last Soviet nuclear-armed missile was withdrawn and left, was 59 days. We talk about 13 days in October as being the big crisis. It lasted for 59 days. The 13 days constituted the period during which we could have gone to nuclear war potentially, all right? But the point is it lasted 59 days. If you go to the siege of Malta, another island, in 1565, that siege lasted 120 days. And ultimately the Turks gave up and left. Now, what I'm trying to get across is that if you're looking for a quick resolution here, it's not coming. In other words, this blockade will continue indefinitely at this point. Can we do that? Well, it all depends on your perspective. I think it's a dumb idea because if it were in the Caribbean, it would be easy. When you're close to home, you're close to your logistical support base, you have harbors where you can replenish, refit, rearm quickly, and then go back into action. That's easy. We're a long, long way from home, and everything has to be flown in or shipped in over an enormous distance. That's why they brought in more light infantry, I suppose, I think, because they figure, well, we're going to need more than that. We have to be able to perhaps launch a feint against one island while we take 2 others. I mean, there could be all sorts of things under discussion. But at the same time, we have now resupplied the fleet. We've resupplied the air forces. Remember, some of our air forces will actually fly from Diego Garcia. Some may fly all the way from Mississippi and Louisiana. And some will come from Germany. And then you will have some that will come as far away as perhaps the Horn of Africa. The bottom line is this is a very difficult thing to do for any power in the world right now. And we are putting everything on the line. That's the problem. We're putting everything on the line. And Donald Trump sees himself as being on the line. So what's he going to do? He's going to attack.
But then if you put China into the mix, they have a say more than ever before. And China's supplying the HQ-9s, the man-pads as well to Iran. There's a meeting between Xi Jinping and Trump. Obviously, Russia has a say as well, could be linked to the whole Ukraine war and some concessions there. We saw what I think with not Rosneft, with Lukoil, the deal they just did to allow Lukoil to continue operating yesterday. So isn't there a possibility that countries could come together, a coalition? Because a lot of countries, including many American allies, can't sustain a continuation of the war. The global economy cannot sustain it as well. And that's something that Trump also pays attention to when he makes his decisions. He pays attention to the voter base, the polls, and the markets. Both these things are saying we cannot have another war. This is the most unpopular war in I don't know how many decades in the US, and the global economy cannot sustain another war, from helium to the microchips to oil to the fertilizers. Japan, South Korea, Pakistan, India, China, Europe, everyone's going to come together and pressure Trump. Eventually something will, and even when you put legacy into the mix, we both agree, and what you've warned about even before the war, that will be militarily disastrous. That is the outcome. So even from a legacy perspective, Colonel, it's already bad, but people can forget it. You could put the Lebanon-Israeli peace deal potentially on the line as a win, turn Iran into a win to the voter, and make it look at least mildly successful from a legacy perspective, and then move to Cuba, try to get a win elsewhere. I know you said there's many possibilities in his minds. What would you give that one in terms of likelihood?
I think you should apply for a job in the White House. Maybe they could put you on the National Security Council staff, and you can go in and tell Trump that. He would find that very interesting and amusing. I'm sure he would pay attention to it. But what will he ultimately decide to do? What do the Israelis want? They are a dominant player. What does Mr. Netanyahu demand? When the vice president of the United States got up from the table in Islamabad and went outside to make a phone call, to whom did he speak? Well, we know that he spoke at least twice to Mr. Netanyahu. To whom is the vice president of the United States reporting? Is he reporting to Donald Trump? Did Donald Trump say anything about talking to either Witkoff or Kushner or Vance during the negotiations? I didn't hear anything. As far as I know, they went there with a very, very limited set of objectives. And those objectives were the same old demands that Mr. Netanyahu has been making. There seems to have been some discussion about enriched uranium and how that might be altered. But then we also know there was a blow-up during the discussions. And Witkoff and Kushner stood up and threatened to leave the negotiations. That's off the table. Now, I don't know specifically what it referred to, but I suspect it probably had something to do with enriched uranium. My point to you is, who is in charge of American foreign and defense policy at this point? Is it Donald?
Do you not think that's changing now? That the sentiment is changing across the US. The polls show people have. I was speaking to a professor from Iran yesterday, and he said something to me. He said, "Mario, most Americans want a one-state solution, and that's Palestine." I'm like, "Professor, there's no way." Now check the polls while he was speaking. According to polls, Grok did an aggregate. 10 to 15% of Americans would like to see young Americans, 18 to 24 years old, would like to see a one-state solution called Israel. 35 to 55% or 35 to 50% would like to see a one-state solution of Palestine, and about 60% would prefer a two-state solution. That's multiple polls, so not just one poll, because the numbers don't add up. But I was pretty shocked to see those numbers. We saw in the Senate a lot of Democrats are breaking ranks with Israeli lobbies and Israeli interests. So isn't it possible that this war could be the straw that broke the camel's back, and we see that big shift? Because Netanyahu doesn't want to deal with Iran. He wants the war to continue, which is why he's saying it will continue. He doesn't want a ceasefire in Lebanon. But could Trump somehow turn it around and see the wave, the anti-Israeli wave from the American public, the younger generation, and take a very different stance to turn this loss into somehow a win by limiting aid to Israel? I know I'm just getting too optimistic here, but limiting aid to Israel, forcing a ceasefire in Lebanon, and moving ahead and ending the war in Iran? I know I sound very optimistic, but I can hope.
Well, it depends on your perspective. I think in the long run, what we have done, what Mr. Netanyahu has done and insisted that we join him in doing, is setting in motion a wave of anti-Semitism that is greater now than at any point since the interwar period. Yeah. That's a great achievement. That's what Mr. Netanyahu has done. Now, there are some sober-minded Israeli Jews who've pointed this out. There are certainly Jews in this country, and you've talked to Jeffrey Sachs. I'm sure if he were here, he would say that's exactly right. The Jewish community always lives in a state of perpetual paranoia about anti-Semitism. And their predisposition is to reach out and destroy anyone they suspect of being an anti-Semite. I think that's part of the problem. In other words, Israel will only be safe as a state, and Jewish international interests will only be safe when all of Israel's enemies are destroyed. If they can't be destroyed, then they have to be subjugated. Take the map of the Greater Israel Project. Look at the map. What does it tell you? That they are creating a very large state in which anyone who is not a Jew is subservient to them or doesn't exist anymore. That's the Greater Israel Project. That's the Amalek solution. That's Netanyahu. I see no evidence that Mr. Netanyahu has abandoned those goals. He may come to a temporary ceasefire with Lebanon to satisfy short-term strategic interests, but it doesn't end the war. The war for him and for the Jewish state is permanent. It is now a permanent state of affairs, and that's the way it's going to stay. Now, what is Donald Trump going to do about that? What do they know about Donald Trump that Donald Trump doesn't want to be made public? What kind of influence do they have over him besides simply enriching him? You know, he's made over $1 billion during his first year in office. I mean, that's unheard of. That did not happen during his first term in office, but it happened during this term. Now, we know that Washington is a stagnant pool of corruption. That's not a mystery. And we've had J.D. Vance, the vice president, actually state that, saying you would be shocked at the level of corruption inside Washington. We all know that. But politicians, even the worst ones, and we have some of the worst that I think we've ever had, want to survive. They have this instinct for survival. And increasingly, as this goes on, they are going to be interested in disengaging from it. At some point, a decision will have to be made by the big donors that bought the election and the people opposing or supporting Donald Trump regarding whether he is now more of a liability than an asset. If they determine he's more of a liability than an asset, then I think you will see the cabinet intervene under the 25th Amendment and remove him from office. But putting J.D. Vance into the president's office is not a big deal for the Israel lobby. He's very much part of that, and he's very much beholden to them. So I don't think they're terribly concerned about that. But I don't think they've reached the point yet where they've decided that Donald Trump is more of a liability than an asset. And I think the attitude right now will be let the quarantine or what is it, blockade run for a while. We'll see if it makes a difference.
He didn't avoid the legal repercussions of calling it a blockade. He didn't go into the quarantine terminology. He went straight to blockade. He doesn't care.
No, he doesn't. The government doesn't care. That's the sad part. That's why the whole notion of the liberal international order is just crap.
Yeah.
Total nonsense. However, we are going to strike. That's an absolute certainty, because it will be one last final attempt to turn it all back. You know, do I think it's going to work? No, I don't. But I'm sure they'll throw everything into it. You know, starts Monday. How long can you keep up intense airstrikes and missile strikes? 4 or 5 days maximum. At that point, you know, you're going to have to step back and reassess what you're doing. I'm sure we'll hit some of the same targets we hit before. I'm sure we'll hit some new ones. And I'm sure an Air Force officer has walked in and says, this is the list. I'm sure if we're going to win, it'll be because of this list. We will hit all of these targets. This is always the false promise of air campaigns. We've got the right targets now. Targets do not equate to a strategy, but in the airman's world, targets are the strategy. So I think we're going to do that. And it's sort of like the German offensive into the Ardennes in December 1944. The generals told Hitler, this is ridiculous. This will not work. We don't have enough fuel. And he decided that he wanted to launch it anywhere. And they gave him all sorts of good reasons to fall back behind the Rhine, redistribute the military power. And if he'd done those things, the war might have lasted another year. But he didn't. He threw it all away on one big throw. He was a gambler. Donald Trump is by nature a gambler. This is a man who has been bankrupt 6 times in his life, declared bankruptcy. Good Lord. How do you manage such a thing? That's almost a business model for him. So he'll gamble one more time. And if it doesn't work, well, then, I'll go out and I'll figure out a way to put a happy face on the dead rat. Look, this is a man that put his face on the figure of Jesus Christ.
What did you think when you saw that post?
Well,
what did you think when the Pope one?
Well, I'm not deeply religious, so
Me neither.
But my view of that is this is absurd. What kind of a man does such a thing? And then when he was confronted with this, what did he say? Well, I thought of myself as a physician, that I was healing things. Oh, come on. This is narcissism on steroids. It's self-delusion on steroids. So if you're asking what's he going to do, I've told you what he's probably going to do. It's not rational. That doesn't matter. People are not rational. Look, the market hasn't figured it out. If you look at the markets right now, the people up ready, they're nuts. They're nuts. We're going to see $200 a barrel of oil pretty soon. Oh, no, we're going to win. Donald Trump's going to open the Strait of Hormuz. Everything's going to resume normality. Even if it resumed normality, the price is going to rise. We've destroyed the supply chain. I was talking to my friends in India, and I said, you've got an extension cord. The extension cord runs from the Persian Gulf 1,000 kilometers to Mumbai. That's being cut. What does this mean? Well, they're rationing cooking oil, rationing gas for cooking. The war has reached the kitchens of Asia. That's where it is. And
what about China? Don't they have much say in all this?
Well, China, again, it's important to understand the Chinese. I don't think most people in the West do. China is not some sort of evil empire that is an octopus that's trying to gain control of everything everywhere. The Chinese are preeminently interested in building up their country, increasing their prosperity, increasing their wealth, and doing business. And they know that if they acquire enough wealth, they can have influence over things that are important to them. But this is not a martial nation. This is not a nation with a long history of military conquest at all. In fact, the only time China really expanded was under the Mongolian dynasty. China is not a warlike state. So the Chinese are very reluctant to commit to any sort of military action. I can't imagine them doing it at this stage. Things would have to get worse. But at the same time, I think the Chinese are saying the Americans are on the path to global suicide. We are destroying ourselves. We are destroying not just our reputation, we're destroying our own prosperity. We're already slipping into a terrible recession. Besant just had a meeting with all the principal oil producers. You know what it's about? Nobody's saying, but we know what it's about. It's about rationing. We're not going to be able to export oil. If we continue to export oil as we're doing right now, where we have all these tankers lined up in the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, we can fill them up. But then at some point, somebody says, wait a minute, we can't afford to do this. What if we can't get what we need? So you're going to see a reining in of many things now in the United States. And we're going into a deep recession. I don't think much of the global South can avoid a depression at this stage. Imagine that. Look at Japan, who's in terrible financial condition as we are. We've harmed all of our friends. So it's obvious everything's transactional for Donald Trump. Oh, you want to be the ambassador to Botswana? You want to be the ambassador to Switzerland? I had $2 million contribution. Thank you very much. You get to go. That is what's been going on. This is bizarre. It's corrupt. It's disgusting. The American people have no idea how bad it is, but they're going to find out over the next 90 days.
How's Iran going to look like? So my assumption is there's going to be a massive balance of power shift in the region. Israel's been acting with a certain level of impunity. I think this will change after Iran's strategic win. Even if we see a bombing campaign of 5 days, I think Iran's positioned itself as the country that controls the Strait of Hormuz. That was always questioned before this war. This war was testing that theory, and I think that theory, we've come to a conclusion that Iran makes the decisions there, whether it's on paper, legally or not. Everyone knows it's always implied that Iran can shut it down whenever it decides to do so. So taking that into consideration, it gives them a lot more leverage, and also takes away the leverage from Israel to always use the US card. If you bomb us, the US may get involved. The US may defund us. Well, I don't think the US would want to be dragged into a war like this after the outcome of this one, putting aside the possible bombing campaign next week. So could we see long-term a massive shift in the balance of power in the region? And what would that mean for the Gulf? What would that mean for Lebanon, Syria?
Well, I wrote something that was published a few months ago in the American Conservative, and I compared what is going on right now, this is before the war began, to what happened in 1492. In 1492, there was a sudden reversal of the flow of wealth and power. The wealth and power until 1492 was in the Ottoman Empire, it was in India, and in the Chinese Empire. That's where all the wealth and power was. But 1492 changed everything. Once we opened up trade with the Americas, we had access to new resources, especially enormous quantities of gold. And everything reversed. The Ottoman Empire was frankly dying on the vine for a couple of centuries before it finally fell over. In other words, wealth, power, technology, it all came together in Europe. And from Europe, it went to North America. What I said several months ago was that I see the trend is now reversing. The trend in terms of power, technology, wealth, gold, silver, rare earths, everything else, that is moving towards Asia. Asia is the new powerhouse. And who are the new great powers? Well, China is obviously going to be the dominant power in Asia, but it would be a mistake to underestimate India. India can make,
Pakistan.
Yeah, well, of course, but even more than Pakistan, Persia. Now, historically in the Middle East, who are the two dominant powers? Persia and the Ottomans. Turkey has yet to be heard from. The Turks are like a fresh power. They have the largest army in NATO. They can put 2 million men into the field in a little over a month. They have modern technology, modern air forces, modern missiles, modern navy. They've got all the instruments of power, and they are waiting patiently on the sidelines. They have sent many, many warnings to the Israelis, and they now confront the Israelis in Syria, which historically they consider to be their territory. They wanted Assad out because Syria, in their minds, is part of Greater Turkey, as is northern Iraq. Now, what happens to Israel if we suddenly fail? How long do the Turks wait to act? I don't know, but they're
Act as in
militarily strike, because the Levant was part of
Israel.
an empire. Absolutely. How long do they wait before they retake ownership of the whole Levant? And what do you do if you're sitting in Egypt? You're General Sisi. You're worried about being removed by all sorts of people for different reasons. But you've got a population seething with anger over what is being done to Palestinian Arabs. What do the Egyptians want to do? They want to go to war. They want to mobilize and march against Israel. I guess what I'm saying is that we haven't heard a lot from all of these various actors lately. But as it becomes increasingly clear that we have failed, that we can no longer impose our will, despite our efforts to do so, prompted by Israel, and that Israel is now severely weakened, its ground force, please, the Israeli Defense Force on the ground is in ruins. They have people that don't show up for duty. Nobody has an appetite for any more fighting. Israel is entirely dependent now on its air force and its missiles. So what happens in the future? I mean, you can paint a number of grim pictures, but I think the picture is pretty obvious. Once it becomes clear that our offensive has failed against Iran to dislodge the Iranians from their position, then we leave. And people say, oh, we can't leave. You know, I had this conversation with David Petraeus in 2005. I went to speak at the Army General Staff College. And I mentioned to him after we'd had a short discussion in his office, I said, Dave, why don't we just leave Iraq? Oh, no, we can't leave. If we leave, then Anbar province will become a platform for the projection of Sunni Islamist terror all over the world. I said, Dave, we're going to leave. And Anbar province is not the place to stage anything. There's nothing there. So what have we done? We're just leaving. What did we do at the end of 8 years in Vietnam? We left. We just left. Why? We don't live there. We're visitors. We're temporary. So who are the winners? The people that you've been noting: China, India, Russia, Iran, Persia, and I would say Turkey. Turkey is going to be a huge winner because it's preserved all of its military power and capability. And it will be on the winning side regardless of what happens because we're leaving. This is the end of our overseas presence all over the world.
Two questions. First, what happens to the Gulf? And second, if Turkey attacks Israel, you're talking about a nuclear armed country. So they have a hell of a deterrent as well, despite Turkey's military capabilities.
It depends. The Pakistanis have always been very supportive of and close with the Turks, and have made it very clear that if Turkey ever needs a nuclear weapon, they'll be provided. So I don't think it's a case of Turkey sort of sitting innocently in the corner waiting to be nuked. I think the Israelis know that if they end up in a fight with the Turks, and I think that's probably inevitable at this point, they're in a lot of trouble. Now, how will this resolve itself? I mean, is it possible that you could still have a large Israeli Jewish community inside New Palestine? Yes, I think that's a possibility. But you're not going to have the Sykes-Picot arrangement anymore. Do you understand?
You're talking about the possible end of the Israeli state as a risk.
Yes, I have always warned against this entire operation after 7 October. I told my Israeli friends who don't want to talk to me anymore because I wouldn't support their program that this could be the end of Israel. And they said, no, it won't. Watch us. Well, what's the key to success for Israel? It's continued uninterrupted control of the United States armed forces and state apparatus. As long as we are subordinate to them and are competing for the opportunity to do whatever they tell us, they'll survive. When that ends, and that's really what you're talking about, Mario, that's what you asked about early on. When that ends, it's over.
And lastly, what happens to the Gulf? You haven't talked about Saudi being a superpower, considering they spend the most on their military in the region, more than Turkey.
So what?
And then can't you have like a Gulf bloc as well, similar to NATO, as a way to deter Iran's dominance in the region, even deter Israel as well after the Qatar strike?
5,000 Turks could conquer Saudi Arabia in a week. I speak as a soldier with knowledge. It's a joke. The Gulf states have played a dangerous game. They played the game that we have America to protect us. We have America on our side. Therefore, you have to tolerate us. Not anymore. Are we going to be invited back in? After all, we have, 27 bases in the region, and 16 of those, I think, are in the various Gulf states. Have we done a good job of protecting them from air and missile attack from Iran? Have we come to their aid and assistance? Where are they living? Most of the elites have fled. They're in Europe or Egypt right now, waiting and watching to see what happens next. I think the old status quo is gone, and that's been the message the Iranians have sent repeatedly, and they're right. They said, we did not suffer this war and fight this war to preserve what was here before the war started. They want us out of the region. And quite frankly, I think they're going to be successful.
And as a final question, Colonel, Lebanon, what do you expect to happen there? We talked about the ceasefire when we started the discussion. We know Hezbollah, as I said before, our first discussion when we first met in Washington was about Hezbollah. That was before the war then. Or that was after the operation, the pager operation. What do you think will happen to Hezbollah? What do you think will happen to Lebanon as a country? They're in a very tricky position, stuck between Israel and Iran.
Well, remember, Lebanon is one of these places that we call it a nation or a country, but in reality, it's part of a region. You know, it's not strictly speaking an independent state. It has been, at least there's a facade of independence. But how long were the Syrians in Lebanon until they finally were driven out, largely by us? Look, Lebanon is a wonderful place. It used to be the sort of banking equivalent of Switzerland in the Middle East. Wonderful place. But the problem is that for that to work, they have to have the protection of great powers. Sometimes that power has been French, sometimes it's been a British, sometimes it's been American, but that's over. I think this entire episode is the last gasp of European colonialism. And I think all of us who are non-residents are going to be booted out. We're not native to the region. We're not going to rule there. That's the problem with Israel. You know, you often hear people say, well, this or that is an artificial construct. Is Israel an artificial construct? Yes, it is. How many Jews were living in Jerusalem and the surroundings in 1915? Roughly 15,000. Why were they there? Well, they were planted there over their objections, by the way, by the Turkish Sultan, because he said, I want you to help stimulate economic development in Palestine. And so they went there, they were given generous tax breaks, and they were there to set up businesses. That's what they were there for. Now, suddenly we ended up with the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and we ended up ultimately with this Israeli state. But it truly is an artificial construct insofar as it's alien to the region in which it resides. Now, there was an opportunity, I think, for Israel to become a normal part of the region. In other words, to coexist. There were things that could happen and could be done. I think that's over now. And that's why in the various corridors of power, whether it's Riyadh or Damascus or Cairo, it doesn't matter where you go in the region, everyone says the same thing. Sykes-Picot is over. It's done. So when this ends, and I think it will end because some of what you said, the economic pressure on us from the world is going to be enormous. I'm sure that Donald Trump, in his final comments on everything, said, well, I was forced to disengage. I had to think of the rest of the world, which is crap. He doesn't think about anybody. But he'll say that. And he'll say that compelled us to leave. He'll never admit any form of defeat. But once that happens, it's over in the region for all the people that don't live there. You're going to see new states, new people emerge. Some of the old elites may try to come back. We'll see how that works. But I do know that Arabs in the region are not terribly enthusiastic about the Epstein class that rules them. And that's how they view them. So I think once this ends, it's a new world. China has been talking about the old world crumbling. It's crumbling. It's gone. We're going to see a new order arise. Now, is that going to be oppressive? Is it going to be progressive? I have no idea. But it's going to be different. And at least it's going to be determined by people who live there as opposed to foreigners.
Colonel, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we'll speak again. But yeah, it's a very gloomy description of what's to come for the region, especially like he talks about a bombing of Iran next week. It's not really what I would like to hear, but also the future of Lebanon. You're talking about the eradication of Israel as a state. It just seems very, very violent.
Well, I think violence is unavoidable.
Everything seems very violent.
Violence is unavoidable. Now, as far as the Israelis are concerned, it also depends on what remains of Israel when the war ends and whoever takes over and what sort of arrangements they are willing to make. In other words, you can't go back to the pre-war Israel, just as you're not going to go back to the pre-war GCC. Everything is going to change.
Yeah.
So that's my view. And we ultimately, Mario, we're going to have so much to do here at home. We have so many problems. Our financial condition is terrible. And, the stock market that is reaching its all-time high right now is going to be reaching all-time lows in the next few months. You're going to see a dramatic reversal. And this is not new. In June of 1929, everything looked rosy. Everyone in the government told everyone who was an investor, we live in an era of unbroken prosperity. And October 1929 rolled around and everybody lost everything. So I think you're going to see something like that happen in 2026.
Well, Colonel, always a pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you, Colonel. Bye, sir. Bye bye.